Welcome back to the Ben Motorcycle Adventures podcast, your hub for everything off-road, dual sport, and motorcycle adventure related. My name is John. I'll be your host, and tonight, let's talk about some things that you should probably do to your motorcycle before setting off on a long adventure ride. You know, some of those things that will promote a seamless adventure for you, that will make your ride more enjoyable, so you can just focus on enjoying the ride and seeing the sights. So again, I've got a list of 10 things that we should talk about there. Thanks for joining us again, and I guess it's time to get down to business here. A couple hours ago, I got a call from a number in Louisiana, and as I usually do, I screen my calls and listen to the voicemail. And it was a gentleman from Louisiana kind of asking me about job opportunities. So I gave him a call back, and it turned out to be a really good conversation. We actually talked for about 30 minutes. He's a recent college graduate, has a couple of degrees, and he's ultimately looking just to get a foot in the door in the industry. And, I think it was a mutually beneficial conversation for us both. Down the road, looks like he could be someone who could, help me out on motorcycle tours in different states and, serve as a sweep rider. And I tried to add as much value to the conversation for him as I could too. But I did recommend him to the site, motorcycleindustryjobs.com. Not a paid promotion for me. I've never talked to those people before, but, for someone looking for a job in the industry, I think that's a great place to start. And as we continue to grow, that's probably a service that I will utilize myself to, again, onboard people to help, with sweep rides and run other facets of the business as we grow. So, again, mutually beneficial conversation. And as always, anybody that makes an inquiry to me, to my business, no matter how big, how small, I'm happy to talk to them, just like I'm happy to talk to anybody on this podcast. Those conversations, those opportunities to speak to people from across the world, they're not opportunities that I take for granted, and ones that maybe you shouldn't too. So anyway, moving on, 10 things that you should do to your motorcycle or motorcycle adventure prep that you should perform before you set off on a long ride. Truth be told, I do a lot of these things to my bike for everyday, 50, 60, 100-mile rides. Some of them are a part of my, what I would call routine maintenance schedule. So, they probably aren't an issue for me. But once you get into a system of checking your bike out prior to these long adventure rides, it becomes pretty seamless. And the upkeep with your bike along the way will take a lot off your plate. So you're not spending countless hours preparing a bike for your motorcycle adventure. The first one on the list, I think should be pretty obvious, but you might be surprised what I've seen throughout the years. But change your oil, right? Manufacturers establish service intervals for oil changes. I would expect most people to adhere to that with their motorcycles. A little plus or minus here or there, not a big issue. If you just recently did an oil change, 50 miles ago, and you're going to set off for an adventure, no big deal. But, if the time has come, you need to start each adventure or each long adventure with fresh oil in the cases. Protect the engine, really protect the life of the bike and a lot of those wear parts in the engine. And again, engine failure isn't something you can really overcome on a motorcycle adventure. There's a lot of things that you can, but if you compromise the internals there, you are probably screwed for the most part, and all you can do is hope that it doesn't happen in a very remote place or after dark or something like that. So change that oil, check that oil. Again, if the trip is of considerable length and you're going to need to perform oil changes along the way, you have a few options. That first option is really simple. You can carry the oil and everything that you need along for the ride. Honestly, this is my least favorite option because I love to travel as light and compact as possible. So I don't really want to carry oil or funnels or whatever the case may be. That's not really what I want to pack in my saddlebags and whatnot. So, but it is an option, and there are people who do it, especially people who ride with panniers. So, option one: bring everything that you need. Option two: if you're lucky like me, when I rode through Idaho, the route traveled right through a town where one of my friends lives. So what did I do? I got on the Rocky Mountain ATV website and I shipped some oil and a filter to his house. And when I arrived that particular afternoon, we did the oil change right in the driveway and I went on my merry way. Under most circumstances, you're probably not going to have, friends or family along your route. That may or may not be an option, but there is one more option. You can always ship your oil and filters to a post office or UPS warehouse or whatever the case may be. I can tell you that Pacific Crest trail hikers have been doing that with food and gear for years and years and years. You can have your stuff held at the post office, pick it up, find a good place to change your oil, and then, in an environmentally conscious fashion, you can dispose of that oil and everything you use for the oil change. So those are your three options if you get out for a long ride and you need to do an oil change. But again, before you set off on the trip, do yourself a favor and start with fresh oil and you'll have some peace of mind there. Number two, air filter. Swap that thing out if it needs replaced. You know what? If you're going to set off on a long adventure and your air filter is in pretty good shape, then obviously I wouldn't worry about it. But if it needs change, don't neglect it. This is the only line of defense that your motorcycle has between itself and dirt, which is the enemy. And again, you want to take care of your motorcycle. You want it to run for a long time. And you don't want to run the risk of having some sort of catastrophic failure while you're out there on a long adventure in a remote area. So this is really easy. This is a really easy maintenance thing. You should already be in the habit of, replacing that filter every time it gets dirty. So just a reminder, and not unlike the oil, if you're going out for a long adventure ride, you can bring along additional filters, or, if you're going to track through the desert for 2 or 3 days where it's going to be dry and dusty, I'd highly recommend you use some filter covers or pack along extra filters. When I bring extra filters, I may start with a brand new one that's already pre-oiled, via the manufacturer, or I may clean some of my existing filters, oil them, and store them in a Ziploc bag. Twin Air has pre-oiled filters, as do other companies. So that's a great option. You could always ship some out to a post office if you're going to be on a really long ride. But if I just need 1 or 2 filters, I'll usually stuff them in my bags with the rest of my motorcycle luggage and make those changes or make those swap outs of the filters as needed. Just as a point of reference, I like to use Twin Air filters. I have used them forever. Never had any engine issues that were related to dirt getting in. So I use and trust those. Not a paid promotion or anything like that. I also like using the Twin Air filter oil just because it looks like it provides a really nice layer of protection. You can set your fingers on the filter and pull back, and the oil is really tacky. It's waterproof. I never see any water in the boot. So just my 2 cents, but there are a lot of good options out there when it comes to filters and filter oils. So, but definitely something for you guys to consider. Another thing I do on these trips is make sure I throw in some rubber gloves. They're obviously in my first aid kit, but I also like to include a few sets with the air filters. They're really nice if you've got to change oil or do some dirty work on the bike. You can keep your hands clean, obviously, for changing out dirty filters. They work really nice, and you can actually wrap your dirty filter up in a rubber glove if you want. But just something to keep in mind. I've used rubber gloves underneath my main gloves when it was raining to keep my hands dry and a little bit warmer. And again, for a lot of the maintenance stuff we do, just protect your hands and keep the chemicals off of them. So that would be a little tip from me. Number three, other fluids in the bike, specifically the radiator fluid. I know a lot of people won't agree with me when I say this, but I honestly swap out my radiator fluid about once a year. Some people will probably tell me that is not often enough, but I've had great results with that throughout the years, so that is what I will continue to do. I use a 50-50 mix of antifreeze and water. I know there are better blends out there in the market, things that probably provide better cooling and protection, but here's the reality. When you're out on a long motorcycle adventure ride, that $40 bottle of radiator coolant that you like to use, that special blend, it's not something that you're going to be able to find along the way, in a small town with a population of 27 people. The likelihood of getting your hands on some antifreeze, either from a store or even hitting up somebody who lives somewhere along the way, are much greater than obviously procuring this special blend. So again, that's just something that I consider for these long adventure rides. I've had good luck with standard antifreeze and water, and that is what I will continue to use throughout the years. Master cylinders, that's another kind of source of fluid that you want to check in on. If you've got a KTM or Husky or a bike with a hydraulic clutch, you're going to want to make sure that the fluid in there is at the appropriate levels and in good shape. Again, same thing can be said for brake cylinders and master cylinders. And as I mentioned in my most recent blog post concerning this, that's another thing that I just swap out about once a year. But you'd be surprised, what kind of, I don't want to call it a performance upgrade, but you'd be surprised how much better your brakes work with the addition of new fluid and, with a thorough bleed job. So definitely something to consider before you set off on a long adventure. But point being, make sure all your fluids are topped off and fresh and ready for a long ride. Brake pads, going to throw that one in there. Very common wear item. If you're riding in the mud or sand, volcanic stuff, ash, things that are very gritty, brake pads are going to wear out in a big hurry. Or if you're riding a large bike even, a heavier bike, a heavier person are going to wear out brake pads quite a bit quicker. So you're going to want to take that into consideration, inspect the pads. You can measure them and just make sure they have enough meat on them. If they don't, it's a very affordable repair, $25 to $35. Should get you a set of pads for either end, and then you're good to go. If your pads are in pretty good shape, one thing that I like to do is pull them out of the calipers, and then I'll get like a flat piece of glass and I'll kind of finish them with sandpaper. I will rough any grooves out of them, take any glaze off of them, blast them off with brake cleaner, and then reinstall them. Just kind of freshen up your brake pads, and again, make sure they're not glazed over so they're making really nice contact with the rotor. Inspect your chain and sprockets. That is a no-brainer. And chain and sprocket care really starts when you put a new chain and sprocket on your bike. The appropriate chain adjustment will add to the longevity of the sprocket. It will add to the longevity of the chain. So first things first, if you've got a new bike or you've put on new chain and sprockets, get that adjustment right. Check it a few times after you break it in because it will stretch, and then monitor it along the way. I check my chain slack before every ride or adventure. If I'm on a long adventure, I will check it periodically throughout the ride. But if you maintain the appropriate adjustments, you will get the most life out of your chain and sprockets. Not unlike a lot of other wear items, dirt, mud, heavy pressure washing, those types of things have a tendency to wear out the chain and sprockets prematurely. Because of the number of revolutions that the countershaft, the front sprocket turns, I will usually replace that one time throughout the life of one chain. So it's 2 front sprockets to 1 rear sprocket and 1 chain. Just a heads up. You don't have to do that, but again, that sprocket is going to see a lot more wear. Chain lube, I've used it throughout the years. I don't necessarily think that it is necessary, especially with the O-ring chains and the X-ring chains that I like to run, those chains are sealed up. But if nothing else, a little bit of lube keeps off the rust. So it might be worth lubing your chain. But when I go on a long adventure ride, I do not take chain lube with me. I just don't think that it's necessary. One easy way to kind of check to see if your chain is worn, an early indicator of that should be the fact that you've adjusted appropriately and it keeps stretching out. That should be a signal to you that it's time to replace that chain and those sprockets. And when I do that, I replace the chain, I replace the sprockets, I replace the sprocket bolts, which, as an aside, with every sprocket I put on every hub, I make sure I utilize nylock nuts, and I use Loctite. You do not want your sprocket bolts coming off. I have a friend that can tell you all about that. It wasn't pretty. So just as another kind of bonus tip, use nylocks on those sprocket bolt nuts and use Loctite. Back to the chain. If, again, you're a heathen for making sure it's adjusted appropriately like myself, but it keeps stretching out, that again should be an indicator, excessive wear on the sprockets if they're really sharp or really rounded. And then one other tip for the chain, you can go back and grab a link on the rear sprocket between two fingers, and if you can pull that off the rear sprocket and the chain is adjusted appropriately, your chain's shot. It's time for a new one. So just a couple little tips there to kind of help you along the way. I would not start a long motorcycle adventure with a chain that is iffy. The risk there of throwing the chain, damaging the cases, or maybe you're cruising along an asphalt section at 60 miles an hour and your chain breaks, not going to be pretty. So that is just one of those things where I will not cut corners. I buy really good chains, really good sprockets, and do everything that I can to take care of them. Doesn't matter if it's just a day ride or a long adventure. You want to keep those things in really good shape. Wheels, I have abused some wheels in my day. It's not uncommon for us dual sport and adventure motorcycle riders to put a few dings in the rims, right? We like the fact that we can ride our bikes anywhere, from point A to point B, but we are not opposed to getting them on the trail and dinging up the rims a little bit with rocks. If you get out there and maybe hit 55 miles an hour and you start to feeling a little bit of wobble in the front end or some vibration or some weird rotation, you probably got a ding or two in your rim. Every time I change my tire, I just inspect the rim, see if there's anything, ridiculous going on there that's going to hurt me. You can always put on wheel weights to try to balance the wheel. You can take the wheels to a shop. They have truing stands. They can get them, close to true if you don't have your own truing stand. So those are options with the wheels. But again, when I have the tires off, I go through the rim, make sure everything's clean so I don't run the risk of getting a flat, make sure my rim strip's in good shape, rim lock's in good shape, and then I just move on. So let's talk about tires. Who does not love throwing a fresh set of knobbies on their bike? I know I do. It's one of the best feelings, right? Amazing acceleration and braking, handling. It's like you can do no wrong. So it would be a rarity for me to go out on a motorcycle adventure without a very fresh set of knobbies. And the reason why is I don't want to run the risk of having any tire related mechanicals that could have been avoided with better rubber. I don't want to run my tires bald. You never know what you're totally in store for with the terrain and how your tires are going to handle that. So improved braking, improved acceleration, better safety. Why would you even flirt with the risk of going out there with haggard tires? So that's definitely something for everyone to consider. You're going to go spend $1,000 or $1,500 going on a motorcycle adventure. I think the $150 to $200 that it'll cost you for a new set of tires is cheap insurance, right? So again, I try to promote adventures that are seamless, and again, we don't want to spend a bunch of time addressing bike issues along the way. One thing I usually do before adventures, just as an aside, I run Bridgestone ultra heavy duty 4mm tubes. Always have, always will. I actually like to get the fresh tires on before an adventure ride and go on one short ride, maybe 50 miles, just to kind of work everything in and make sure I didn't pinch the tube, make sure there isn't an issue with the tire. So under most circumstances, I don't start adventures with a brand new tire. I guess I would call it kind of broken in, but it gives me a little peace of mind knowing that everything's settled in, and again, we're not going to have issues with flats or we didn't put on a tire that's got a damaged sidewall or anything like that. So again, best to start these long rides with good rubber. If your rear tire is decent and it's not a directional, you can always turn it around and get a little bit of an edge out of it. And I'm not trying to get everybody just to spend a bunch of cash on new tires, but if you're going on a 300-400 mile ride and your knobby's half worn, you're good to go. I'm talking about going 2, 3, 5,000 miles, where you're going to burn through your tire for the most part. You may even swap your tire out along the way. So just something to consider. But good tires, again, always great to go riding with brand new tires. Electrical components and wiring. Wow, nothing will end a ride quicker than an electrical problem. The likelihood of you being able to diagnose that electrical problem when you're out in the middle of nowhere is really slim. The likelihood of you having everything that you need to address the electrical problem, again, pretty slim unless it's just a fuse or a ground or something like that. So it's best to kind of inspect your wires periodically, maybe every 4 to 5 months. Make sure that you don't have any weird wear. Make sure your connections are good and things like that. Obviously, you're riding a dual sport or adventure bike. You want to make sure your headlights work, tail lights, blinkers, things like that. You want to make sure all that is in good working order. One thing that I like to do with all the electrical connections on my bike is use dielectric grease. Every time I buy a new bike, I go through all the connections and put a little bit of dielectric grease in them. This will help, reduce corrosion and keep water out of those connections, and again, provide longevity and again, help promote seamless rides where you're not, stranding yourself essentially. So other than that, I may reroute some wires on my bike if I think they're vulnerable. That's not something that we want to deal with, ripping off a wire, pinching a wire, whatever. And some of those connections, larger connections, I may actually wrap them in electrical tape and reroute them or whatever. If I think they're vulnerable for one reason or another, I may wrap them up in electrical tape. And then, if I happen to need that electrical tape for something else along the way, I know what I have it wrapped around if I have to call on it and use it for a different purpose. So again, inspect those electrical components periodically. That is my worst nightmare, an electrical problem out on a long adventure ride or a trail ride. I can tell you back in 2010, I had a fuel pump go out on a CRF 450, and this isn't something that I necessarily could have prevented. It just went out, but it's one of those things. Once it goes out, there I was. Luckily, I was riding with other people, so I wasn't stranded, but again, just a bad situation. So you can't prepare for everything. If a fuel pump comes out, odds are you won't be like Ben Motorcycle Adventures carrying an extra fuel pump. But there's a lot of maintenance you can do to maintain those too, and I won't get into that. But again, just inspect the electrical stuff and make sure it is adventure worthy. So last item, and this is one of my periodic maintenance things, is just greasing pivot points. When I get a brand new bike, I don't care what the factory's done. I go right to the steering head. I go right to the swing arm and the linkage, if I have a bike with a linkage, and I grease all those bearings. For me, that just establishes a baseline. I write down when I did it, and then I do it a year later. If I ride a lot of mud or sand, I may do it more frequently, but that gives me peace of mind knowing that those bearings aren't going to seize up and cause me problems along the way. Those bearings are also rather expensive, speaking from experience, and you don't want to have to replace them. So if you can't remember the last time you greased any of these pivot points, it's probably a good time to inspect the bearings, and if they're still good, get them greased up and then, just maintain them on a schedule. I think that is it. Those are the 10 things I wanted to talk about that you need to do to your motorcycle before you go out on a long adventure ride. Hopefully you guys found, let me rephrase that. Hopefully you guys found some value in those items. And again, a lot of them you could branch out into, yearly or every 6 month kind of maintenance routines, and you can really trim down the amount of work that you need to do to your bike before you go out on a long motorcycle adventure. When I took off for Idaho this year, my bike prep was probably only an hour and a half, and that's really where you want it to be. You don't want to get into these jobs where you're burning the midnight oil just to get your bike into shape before you go for a ride. So hope you guys will utilize hopefully you guys will use these tips before you set off on your next adventure. And again, as per usual, open invitation if you want to come on the podcast and talk moto to me, talk adventure. Let's set something up. Let's get that done. Again, you can reach me, benmotorcycleadventures@gmail.com. I'm on Instagram and Facebook at benmotorcycleadventures and www.benmotorcycleadventures.com. www.benmotorcycleadventures.com. We're an off-road, dual sport, and motorcycle adventure company operating on the West Coast. We want you guys to come out and experience bucket list tours with us, so think of us next time you're thinking of a ride. I know you'll enjoy it, and we want more people to experience this. So I'm going to sign off. I appreciate you guys listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.